Well, locate again in your Bibles this evening the Old Testament prophecy of Joel. It's page 760 in your church Bibles. Hopefully we had some practice this morning finding it, but if not, it's toward the end of the Old Testament. Isaiah, Jeremiah, Lamentations, Ezekiel, Daniel, Hosea, Joel. And I won't quote backwards from Malachi. I could do in the past. One of these days, maybe I'll do it again. But let's read from Joel chapter 1. Hear this, you elders. Give ear, all inhabitants of the land. Has such a thing happened in your days or in the days of your fathers? Tell your children of it, and let your children tell their children and their children to another generation. What the cutting locust left, the swarming locust has eaten. What the swarming locust left, the hopping locust has eaten. And what the hopping locust left, the destroying locust has eaten. Awake, you drunkards, and weep and wail, all of you drinkers of wine, because of the sweet wine, for it is cut off from your mouth. For a nation has come up against my land, powerful and beyond number. Its teeth are lion's teeth, and it has the fangs of a lioness. It has laid waste my vine and splintered my fig tree. It has stripped off their bark and thrown it down, and their branches are made white. Lament like a virgin wearing sackcloth for the bridegroom of her youth. The grain offering and the drink offering are cut off from the house of the Lord. The priests mourn, the ministers of the Lord. The fields are destroyed and the ground mourns, because the grain is destroyed, the wine dries up, and the oil languishes. Be ashamed, O tillers of the soil. Wail, O vine dressers, for the wheat and the barley, because the harvest of the field has perished, and the vine dries up, and the fig tree languishes. Pomegranate, palm, and apple, all the trees of the field are dried up, and gladness dries up from the children of men. And I want to stop just there for a moment. We will read to the conclusion later. But this evening, I want us to focus really on getting to grips with the sweeping message of this prophecy. The verses that we just read are not instantly encouraging, are they? There's a lot of destruction, a lot of devastation, carnage, calamity, chaos. It's a nightmarish, apocalyptic scene following on from a cataclysmic event that has utterly wrecked their nation. Think of it like this. An agricultural nation is dependent upon the harvest, is it not, for thriving economy? And when the harvest fails, the economy fails. And when the economy fails, people don't have food to eat. They don't have nice things to drink, at least. They don't have the nourishment, the food, the drink that they would be accustomed to. And so they're not only physically suffering now, but there's also emotional suffering that's entailed. And that really is what's depicted. We see at the heart of this passage, the end of the passage that we read, the heart of this chapter, this terrible statement, gladness dries up from the hearts of men, from the children of men. what is it like for gladness to dry up? Not to be happy, not to be filled with joy, to instead, once the land flourished. Once it was called a land flowing with milk and honey. And you can, reading the descriptions of this land in earlier portions, you get this idea of a lush landscape, which is covered in fertile soil and rich, healthy produce. And it's this wonderful image of a place that's perfect for planting. And so plant they did, and the things that grew were great and strong. And we have this image of when they sent spies into the land, and they came back bearing clusters of grapes, and they'd never seen grapes that size. And it's just great, beautiful, all is well. And then the locusts come. It's not even that they didn't have enough rain. It's not that the ground dried up and couldn't nourish the crops anymore. It's just that a certain combination of heat and moisture led to a particularly productive breeding season for the locusts. And they're swarming. And they're, what was just an innocent grasshopper or two has developed into a great cloud of locusts sweeping over the land, devouring everything. They've planted. Perhaps one night they went to bed after having surveyed their fields and seeing, look, the crops are going to be ready for harvest here in a day or two. And they wake up and they know something's wrong. What's the sound in the air? This chirping and buzzing, and it's this infernal noise, and they look out and the sky is dark. The sun should have been risen by now, but they're looking, it seems overcast today. Why is that? And they look out, and it's not because the sun is not shining. It's that it has been blotted out by swarms of millions of locusts, waves of them. So one wave eats this, and they're thinking, no, we're at least holding on to something. And then another wave takes it, and he gives 4 waves. We'll talk more about that next week. But 4 waves of locusts come in and devour everything. What did they have left? Towards the end of these verses, it's not only the grain that's affected, but he talks about the vine drying up and the fig tree languishing and the pomegranate and the palm and the apple, these things from which they derive juices and oils, and everything's dried up. But it's like there's one thing worse than the trees of the field drying up, and that is the gladness of the children of men. That people are miserable, that people are sad, that they're depressed, that they are like those trees that once were lush and flourishing. They are like that land which once was laden with healthy produce, and their life is dried up. And they feel that there is nothing left for them. Even that they can't carry on. They wonder, what is my purpose? What is my meaning? What is the point of my existence? They remember what it was like to smile. They remember what it was like to laugh. They remember when they would sing and they would dance, and those summer nights in the street when the sun was was going down, and it was late, and they were sat out in the families, and they were eating, and they were talking, and they were just enjoying good fellowship with each other and music together, and it was all good. But there's no gladness in their hearts now. Their gladness has dried up like all the other plants. It's pretty sad, isn't it? What happens, do you think, when gladness dries up? What replaces gladness? It's not just that gladness disappears. Gladness is pushed away by something stronger, right? It's driven out. Grief. When your gladness dries up, and you have no reason to smile, and you have no reason to sing, and no reason to dance, and the glimmer that was in your eyes has faded, and it's like you don't even know how to be happy anymore because of the struggles in your life and the pressures that you're facing, and it feels like everything's eaten up. Your grief begins to pour out. And that's what we have here. The waves of locusts have come across the land, and they're like weeping, wailing, mourning. These expressions of grief appear repeatedly throughout this chapter and indeed the book, the prophecy. Just pouring it out. The rain didn't fall, but plenty of tears fall. The locusts devoured the crops, destroyed everything. But one thing that you can count on when destruction comes, and that is it's not strong enough to destroy man's capacity to be sad. That's always there until it's taken from us in the new heavens and the new earth, where there are no more tears and no more suffering. You will always be able to cry. You'll not always be able to laugh. And their grief is poured out, and they're burdened. And I know every one of you in this room has had a time in your life where your grief has poured out, and you feel like you're dried up stalk of some dead plant, chewed to pieces by swarms of locusts, perhaps. Maybe that's not past tense. Maybe that's not something you have experienced. Maybe that's something you are experiencing now. Maybe it's someone else's fault. Maybe it's your fault. But you are well acquainted with grief. There's a pretty graphic image at the heart of the verses that I read. Verse 8, read that. Lament like a virgin wearing sackcloth for the bridegroom of her youth. Sometimes we just read through stuff like this and we don't actually take it to heart what it's saying. But imagine this. Can I get really, really personal? Painfully personal. Okay? You two on the back. Can I single you out? You're not married, right? No. I don't want to get... I'm not sure. There is a thing between you, though, right? I thought there was. Yeah. So... suppose the time comes when genius pops the question, right? Right? It's not now. This is not one of those weird moments where he's going to say, no, yeah, I'm going to drop the knee here. This is an opportune moment. That would be awkward. This is a sad passage of Scripture. Now's not the time. But you're going to pop the question. And you do. And I don't know. I'm hoping maybe things have developed to that point. Maybe she says, okay, yeah, good. Yes, absolutely. Okay. So, fast forwarding, I don't know what stage you're at in your relationship, but whenever that is, if that is, a few weeks from the wedding, you're really looking forward to it. God forbid, as our Nigerian friends like to say, whenever they are about to say something absolutely terrible, but Jenga, something horrific happens, and you die. Just a few weeks before the wedding. Your wife-to-be is going to be devastated. Yeah? I would think so. If you had a healthy relationship, I would hope she would say, it is what... If she says, it is what it is, I'm calling the police, and I'm saying, I want to investigate this person, Lament like a virgin wearing sackcloth for the bridegroom of her youth. A young woman looking forward to getting married, and her husband dies before the day. That's as bad as it gets. Yeah, that's raw. And that's what he's saying, your grief. He's actually calling them to grief, but the reality is their grief is already kind of like this. They're already, because of their circumstances and their situation, in a time of prolonged and painful mourning. Is there any hope? Is there any hope for people whose gladness has dried up? Who don't know how to be happy anymore? Is there any hope for people whose grief is poured out and it's like it's being poured out endlessly? You know, that woman whose husband-to-be dies just a couple of weeks beforehand? He's dead. She may never recover from that. She may live the rest of her life mourning. And certainly, in the days, weeks, and months that follow, I think it's fair to say that she is going to be as depressed as she could ever be in her life. She's going to need family and friends, her church to come around her and minister to her and help her, right? Because it doesn't get worse than that. Will she ever heal? Some might say no. Imagine 2 weeks in, 3 weeks, 5 weeks. I think I said it was 5 weeks or so before the wedding. You get to the day itself, and you just thought it was bad. And then you hit the day that was to be your wedding day, and you realize, I just thought it was bad. It just got worse. Is there any hope for the broken? Is there any salvation for the suffering? Or is there comfort for those who mourn? Yes. You see, here we are on our broken planet, dead in our trespasses and sins, facing the consequences of life in a devastated world that has been wrecked by our wickedness. And God remains. Our life situations do not impact the presence and power of God. Our circumstances do not affect Him. Do they affect you and me? Yes. Do we have moments of grief? Yes. Do we have moments where we're not so glad? Absolutely. But does God ever change? Absolutely not. There is a principle, an attribute of God, and that is the immutability of God. That the unchangingness of God, the unchangeableness of God. The fact that God is not subject to our situations. God is over our situations. God is not impacted adversely by our suffering. God is over our suffering, and He is staggeringly, scandalously, He is working in and through our sufferings to His glory and ultimately, believe it or not, our good. And so I didn't read all of the text earlier, but let me continue to read with verse 13. Put on sackcloth and lament, O priests. Wail, O ministers of the altar. Go in, pass the night in sackcloth, O ministers of my God, because grain offering and drink offering are withheld from the house of your God. Consecrate a fast, call a solemn assembly, gather the elders and the inhabitants of the land to the house of the Lord your God, and cry out to the Lord. Why are they crying out to the Lord? Because their grain may be gone, but God isn't. He's still there. Their gladness may be dried up, but God hasn't dried up. Their grief may be poured out, but that doesn't mean that God is incapable of replacing that grief with a gladness greater than that which they previously knew. And so they cry to Him, they fast, they pray, they gather together and cry out to the Lord. What do they cry out to Him? Verse 15, alas for the day of the Lord is near, and as destruction from the Almighty it comes. Is not the food cut off before our eyes? Joy and gladness, there it is again, joy and gladness dried up, joy and gladness cut off from the house of our God. Lord, we would love to gather here and worship You. We would love to assemble here and sing praises to Your name. We would love to give offerings of sacrifice to give You thanks. He said that there's no grain for the grain offerings. And these were not sacrifices or offerings for sin. These were offerings of thanksgiving and praise. But they find themselves in a condition, in a situation that does not enable them to give such praise because there is no grain to offer. The seed shrivels under the clods. The storehouses are desolate. The granaries are torn down because the grain has dried up. How the beasts groan. And the herds of cattle are perplexed because there is no pasture for them. Even the flocks of sheep suffer. So what do? To You, O Lord, I call. Fire has devoured the pastures of the wilderness. Flame has burned all the trees of the field. The beasts of the field pant for You. The water brooks are dried up. Fire has devoured the pastures of the wilderness. But to You, O Lord, I call. I call to Yahweh, who is God. Because He is there. And though my grain goes, and my grapes shrivel up, and I can't eat and I can't drink to the glory of God, God is still there to be glorified. And so I go to Him. I look to Him in my calamity. I look to Him out of the carnage and chaos of my life, and I call to Him to help me and to save me. Might it be even that this circumstance has developed because I have not done so with the regularity that I should. Perhaps it is His will that maybe I have done so and so far as I could, but He wants me to do so at a deeper level, to know and appreciate His power and His provision in a way that although I appreciate it somewhat, now I really know in the depths of my being in a way that I couldn't have known had He not dried up my gladness and enabled me to pour out my grief. God remains. So to You, O Lord, I call. And this is the amazing thing, that although God is not affected in His being by our gladness drying up, and He's not impacted by our grief being poured out. Again, that is God in His being and essence. The wonder of the gospel is that God stepped into this world of grief. He knew what it is to be glad, and He knew what it is to have gladness taken from Him. He knew what it is to be filled with song and rejoicing, to make offerings of praise. And He knew what it is to cry, to weep, and to do so as though there's no hope. Such is the violence of His internal warfare the night before His crucifixion, that the capillaries in His face break and the blood begins to come out with His sweat. That the unchanging and unchangeable God, immutable, above our suffering, above our gladness and our grief, took on our grief, carried our griefs, so that we might have gladness restored. Later on in this prophecy, we read that the Lord became jealous for His land and had pity on His people. We read how He restored the grain and the oil, their satisfaction. But there was something greater that He did. He said, "It shall come to pass that I will pour out my Spirit on all flesh." And so it is not just the grain He restores. And it's not just the wine He gives back. But it is a wellspring of eternal comfort that He provides. Indeed, the Spirit is called by Jesus our Comforter, our Encourager. And in pouring out the Spirit on all flesh, He made it so that Pentecost could be celebrated. But not celebrated simply with gifts of grain, because we don't do that anymore. But on the greatest Pentecost of all, those 50 days after the crucifixion and resurrection of Jesus Christ, He poured out His Spirit on all flesh. And He sent them out to be witnesses to the saving good news of Jesus, who is more than grain, sweeter than wine, who forever is our gladness, who does not leave us alone in our grief. Brothers and sisters, has your gladness ever dried up? Is it dry tonight? Has your grief ever poured out? Have you ever wept and the tears flowed? Have they flowed till there are no more tears left to cry, and it's just your face that feels like it's breaking because of the pain, but the tears won't come because there's nothing there? God remains. He's always there. And you feel weak, but He is always strong. You feel alone, but He is near to all who call on Him. Jesus said to those who trust in Him, He is with them, even to the end of the age. So if you're not glad, if you're grieving, look to God. If you're not grieving, but you're glad, look to God. Because in all seasons of life, He's worth it. He is worthy. Do we treat Him as though He's worthy? Do we honor and worship Him as though He's worthy? Do we trust in Him as though He's worthy? Do we really know not only that Yahweh is God, but do we know and believe that He is God over us? And as God over us, He's over even the darkest, saddest parts of us, working in and through all things for His glory and our good.